Jim Morrison. The Lizard King. A leather-clad poet whose voice became the soundtrack for a generation. To millions, he was a rock god, a shaman who promised to break on through to the other side. But what was he like to the legends who shared his orbit? It turns out, some of the biggest names in rock and roll didn't just dislike Jim Morrison, they hated him. From backstage brawls to scathing public insults, this is the story of the rockstars who couldn't stand the frontman of the Doors. There are names in rock and roll that feel more like myth than man, and Jim Morrison is definitely one of them. He wasn't just a singer, he was a phenomenon. The intellectual, the madman, the voice that invited an entire generation to rebel. His posters were on countless bedroom walls, and his voice defined a turbulent era. With the Doors, he created a sound that felt intoxicating and dangerous, a mix of blues, psychedelia, and raw theater that was completely new. He was the quintessential rock star. Beautiful, unpredictable, and ultimately, doomed, but what was it like to actually know the guy? For the fans, he was a god. For his peers, the other giants of rock, the reality of Jim Morrison was often a different story. The same energy that mesmerized millions up close felt like insufferable arrogance. The wild, unpredictable performances that made him a legend were, off-stage, just a terrifying spiral fueled by a staggering amount of booze and drugs. The truth is, for every fan who worshipped him, there was a fellow musician who saw right through the act. They saw a poser, not a poet. A sham, not a shaman. Today, we're looking past the legend to hear the stories from the people who were actually there. We're counting down the rockstars who, when they came face to face with the Lizard King, were filled with a genuine, burning dislike. To get why Frank Zappa couldn't stand Jim Morrison, you have to get Zappa. He was a beacon of militant sobriety and relentless hard work in an ocean of psychedelic excess. He was a composer and a satirist who demanded absolute discipline. He didn't just dislike the 60s drug culture, he saw it as a creative poison, a marketing trick that turned musicians and their fans into children. And in his eyes, no one represented the toxic glamour of that culture better than Jim Morrison. Zappa saw Morrison not as some visionary artist, but as a tragic cliché, a smart guy who got eaten alive by his own hype and addictions. For Zappa, who demanded surgical precision from his band, the idea of celebrating Morrison's chaotic, out-of-control stage antics was ridiculous. He believed the stuff fans called shamanistic was just the sad, predictable result of being completely wasted, and that it glamorized self-destruction. This was a core part of Zappa's philosophy. In one interview, he explained his problem wasn't with Jim the person, but with the machine that built the Lizard King. Zappa said, the thing that was obnoxious about Jim Morrison was when Crawdaddy decided to proclaim him the Lizard King of rock and roll and went on this bizarre rampage. And the type of merchandising that was originally associated with Doors music I thought was really distasteful and stretching the boundaries of what it actually was beyond the realm of credibility. To Zappa, Morrison was the ultimate product of hype, a symbol of the public's desire for shiny images over substance. He felt rock journalism had fed them an inflated myth about a man who was really just another casualty of the industry. In Zappa's lyrics for Tinseltown Rebellion, he takes a direct shot at the culture Morrison left behind, mocking the rock and roll scene where Jim Morrison once stood. It's a line dripping with contempt, not just for Morrison, but for the entire myth-making machine. Zappa's dislike was a complete philosophical rejection of everything Morrison came to represent. Chaos over discipline, image over substance, and self-destruction as a stand-in for genius. If Frank Zappa's dislike was a cold, intellectual takedown, Jerry Garcia's was a raw, gut-level reaction. As the leader of the Grateful Dead, Garcia was the heart of the San Francisco scene, a world built on community, authenticity, and musical exploration. When he looked at Jim Morrison, he saw the exact opposite, a phony, offensive product of slick, shallow Los Angeles. Garcia never minced words. In a famous interview, he was brutally honest, I never liked the Doors. I found them terribly offensive, when we played with them. His biggest problem? He saw Morrison as a total copycat. It was back when Jim Morrison was just a pure Mick Jagger copy, Garcia said. That was his whole shot, his moves, his whole physical appearance were totally stolen from right around Mick Jagger's 1965 tour. For an artist like Garcia, who prized originality, this was the ultimate sin. He saw Morrison's leather-clad swagger as a carefully constructed pose, lifted straight from a better frontman. This feeling of phoniness carried over to Morrison's poetry. While fans called him the next Rimbaud, Garcia scoffed. He started to earn a reputation as a poet, which I thought was really undeserved, Garcia said. Rimbaud was great at 18, 19. Those guys were great. Fuckin' Jim Morrison was not great, I'm sorry. Musically, Garcia was just as dismissive. The Grateful Dead sound was a sprawling, improvised jam. The Doors, by contrast, sounded brittle and sharp-edged to him. He hated that they didn't have a real bass player, and he felt their music lacked the deep, bluesy soul that was the foundation of his own work. All I sensed was sham, he concluded. As far as I was concerned, it was just surface and no substance. This was also a culture clash. To Garcia, the Doors were Los Angeles invading San Francisco. All about having the look right, but zero substance. It was Hollywood commercialism versus the organic, communal spirit of Haight-Ashbury. For Jerry Garcia, Jim Morris wasn't just some musician he didn't like, he was the embodiment of everything that was corrupting the counterculture. From the gritty, intellectual art scene of New York City, Lou Reed looked at the sunny psychedelia of the West Coast with total contempt. As the leader of the Velvet Underground, Reed was pioneering a different kind of rock, raw, noisy, and unflinchingly real. His world was Andy Warhol, street life, and avant-garde art, a universe away from California's flower power. And at the center of that world he despised was Jim Morrison. Reed utterly loathed the hippie movement and saw the Doors as its most pretentious ambassadors. He dismissed Morrison's entire Lizard King persona as absurd, viewing him as a performer whose image was distasteful and exaggerated. In Reed's world, the Velvet Underground was for really, really smart people, while the California scene, with Morrison as its poet king, was really, really stupid. There was also a specific accusation of theft that fueled Reed's anger. The Warhol crowd, where the Velvets got their start, believed Morrison had flat-out stolen his signature look from one of their own, the dancer Gerard Malenga. The tight black leather pants, the confrontational stare, they felt Morrison took the authentic, dangerous edge of the New York underground, stripped it of its meaning, and sold a watered-down version to the masses in LA. The animosity was deep. Reed saw the Doors' mix of rock and performance art as a shallow imitation of the experiments he was conducting with the Velvet Underground. Where Reed offered brutal realism, he felt Morrison offered bloated, pseudo-mystical nonsense. It was a clash between two opposite poles of the 60s, the dark, cynical art of New York versus the psychedelic spirituality of LA. Reed's contempt for Morrison is best captured by a quote that is widely attributed to him, though its original source is unconfirmed. Upon hearing that Jim Morrison had died in a bathtub in Paris, Reed reportedly quipped, "How fabulous. I have no pity at all for that silly Los Angeles person." It was a final, biting dismissal, summing up his view of Morrison as an absurd, pretentious figure. To Lou Reed, Jim Morrison wasn't a rival, he was a joke. Not everyone kept their dislike for Jim Morrison to sarcastic comments. For Janis Joplin, the queen of psychedelic soul, her run-in with Morrison ended in legendary violence. The story perfectly shows how Morrison's drunken aggression could alienate even his most hard-living peers. As the legend goes, the two were at a party in the Hollywood Hills, brought together by their shared producer, Paul Rothchild. At first, there was a spark. Joplin was a little starstruck, and Morrison was captivated by her raw energy. But as the night went on and the drinks flowed, things turned sour. Morrison got drunker and more belligerent, turning, as Rothchild later put it, into a cretin. His advances toward Joplin became aggressive and crude. Her admiration quickly turned to disgust, but he refused to take no for an answer. The situation blew up when Joplin decided to leave. As she was getting into a car, Morrison followed her out, allegedly grabbing her by the hair to try and pull her back. This was a huge mistake. Janis Joplin was no damsel in distress. In a flash, she grabbed the one thing she always had nearby, a bottle of Southern Comfort. Without a second thought, she smashed it over Jim Morrison's head, reportedly knocking him out cold. The weirdest part of the story is what happened next. According to Rothschild, when Morrison came to, he was even more infatuated with her. He supposedly gushed, "What a great woman. She's terrific," and begged for her phone number. Rothschild had to gently tell him, "Jim, Janis doesn't think it would be a good idea for you two to get together again." They never did. This explosive encounter became a rock and roll legend, a violent reminder of the side of Jim Morrison many of his peers saw up close. While fans saw a sex symbol, Janis Joplin saw a creep who couldn't handle rejection, and she dealt with him accordingly. If you're enjoying these stories from behind the music, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're digging into rock history every single week, and you don't want to miss what's coming up next. Now, back to the rockstars who couldn't stand Jim Morrison. In the world of 1960s rock gods, Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison were two of the biggest. Hendrix was the master, a guitarist who completely reinvented the instrument. Morrison was the poet, a frontman channeling a dark, primal energy. A jam session between them should have been legendary. Instead, it became a perfect example of how Morrison's self-indulgence could ruin a moment of musical magic and piss off one of his most respected peers. The place was the Scene Club in New York, March of 1968. Hendrix was on stage jamming with some other great musicians, and the vibe was electric. In the audience was Jim Morrison, already deep into his drunk and disenchanted phase. Fueled by ego and booze, Morrison decided he had to be part of the show. He stumbled on stage, grabbed a mic, and proceeded to crash the whole thing. What followed wasn't a legendary duet, it was a chaotic mess. Instead of singing, Morrison just started howling and screaming random, obscene phrases into the microphone. You can hear it on bootleg recordings like "Bleeding Heart." While Hendrix is trying to lead the band, Morrison's drunken wailing just stomps all over the music. At one point, Morrison was so gone that he just fell to the floor, still screaming gibberish into the mic. The other musicians were clearly annoyed. For Hendrix, who took his music dead seriously, it was beyond frustrating. He had created a sacred space for music, and Morrison had just drunkenly bulldozed it. His reckless behavior and total lack of professional respect were on full display. He saw a stage, and he had to make it all about him. While Hendrix never went on a public tirade against Morrison, his actions spoke volumes. That disastrous jam was the last time they ever shared a stage. The meeting of these two titans wasn't a magical fusion of genius, it was a collision that left everyone with a lasting impression of Jim Morrison as a man whose chaos completely overshadowed his charisma. By 1969, Led Zeppelin was on its way to becoming the biggest band in the world, known for shows that were both powerful and incredibly professional. The Doors, on the other hand, were at the peak of their fame but also at the peak of their frontman's decline. When the two bands crossed paths at the Seattle Pop Festival, the guys in Zeppelin got a front-row seat to the Jim Morrison circus, and they were not impressed. Jimmy Page and Robert Plant went into the crowd to watch the Doors set. What they saw wasn't a shaman captivating the audience, but a drunken mess. Morrison was reportedly swearing at the crowd and making obscene gestures. In a 1970 interview, Robert Plant recalled the scene with disgust. Morrison went on stage and said, "F you all," which didn't really do anything except make a few girls scream. He described Morrison hanging off the stage, acting out in a way that was just pathetic as he got fatter and dirtier and more screwed up. For Plant, watching from the crowd, it was a sickening spectacle. "It was really sickening to watch," Plant said bluntly. We couldn't believe it. This reaction gets at the core difference between the two bands. Led Zeppelin, for all their own wild stories, were total professionals on stage. Their power came from precision and musicianship. Morrison, in their eyes, was doing the opposite. He was indulging his own demons at the expense of the music and the audience. Plant felt Morrison was trapped in a big play act, taking himself so seriously he'd lost touch with reality. While Jimmy Page respected the Doors' albums, the live performance was an embarrassment. That night in Seattle solidified Led Zeppelin's view of Jim Morrison as a cautionary tale, a man who had squandered his immense talent in a haze of booze and ego. Maybe the most heartbreaking story of dislike for Jim Morrison comes not from a rival, but from inside the Doors. John Densmore, the band's brilliant drummer, had a relationship with his frontman that was a storm of love, admiration, fear, and deep resentment. To say Densmore hated Morrison is too simple. He despised the self-destructive demon that was consuming his friend, a person he later called a psychopath. Densmore was the conscience of the Doors, the one most disturbed by Morrison's dive into alcoholism. While fans saw the Lizard King, Densmore saw a man becoming dangerously unhinged. He saw Morrison's dark side up close, even recalling a time he found Morrison menacing a woman with a knife. This wasn't a poet, this was a man losing control, and it terrified him. The tension got so bad that Densmore actually quit the band for a day, only to come back, trapped by loyalty and the band's insane success. The final straw was a disastrous show in New Orleans in December 1970, where a rambling Morrison effectively ended the Doors' touring career. When Morrison died in Paris a few months later, Densmore's reaction wasn't just grief. It was mixed with anger and helplessness. He was so upset with Jim for his carelessness that he skipped the funeral and didn't visit his grave for 3 years. In his autobiography, Riders on the Storm, Densmore wrote that it took me years to forgive Jim. This conflict became a public fight. Years later, Densmore became the fierce protector of the Doors' legacy. He famously vetoed a $15 million offer from Cadillac to use "Break On Through" in a commercial, saying it would betray the spirit of the anti-corporate Jim Morrison he knew. This led to a bitter lawsuit against his own bandmates, a fight Densmore ultimately won. His story is the most painful indictment of all. He loved the shy poet he first met, but grew to despise the monster that alcoholism unleashed. It's a testament to Morrison's chaos that the man who played beside him every night was also one of his fiercest and most wounded critics. So what do you do with all of this? How does the myth of Jim Morrison, the rock god, square with the reality of Jim Morrison, the man so many of his peers couldn't stand? These stories all point to the same issues. There was the substance abuse, which was extreme even for that era. There was the perceived arrogance and a habit of stealing his act from others, whether it was Mick Jagger's moves or the New York Underground style. And most of all, there was his profoundly unprofessional behavior. From crashing a Hendrix jam to sickening Robert Plant, Morrison constantly alienated his peers with a total lack of respect for them, the audience, and the music itself. While millions of fans were mesmerized by his vision, the musicians who saw him up close saw a cautionary tale of wasted talent, a man consumed by his own demons. The legend of Jim Morrison is permanent, his impact is undeniable. But the man himself was far more complex, a figure who inspired not just worship, but a deep and lasting hatred from the very people who should have been his brothers in arms. So, what do you think? Was Jim Morrison a misunderstood genius, or was he a rock and roll disaster whose legend has completely overshadowed the flawed reality? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.